Hello everybody, I'm Chris. I'd like to welcome you all back to my series called Analyzing Literature. And this episode today is a continuation of the short story that we started to discuss in the previous episode. The story is called The Woman in the Snow. And today we're going to look at the second part of the story. So, just to recap quickly, what we're doing with this short story is we're actually reading the entire short story. It's actually about 10 pages worth of text. But we're going to walk our way slowly through the story and analyze each part separately. And then when we conclude the short story, what we're going to do is we're going to gather all of our information together and we're going to write at least a 3-paragraph essay to illustrate how to compose a good solid introductory paragraph, how to compose a good solid body paragraph, and how to compose a good solid concluding paragraph, so that it will give a good model and a good illustration of the ingredients that will go into making a quality analytical essay. So in order to do that, we have to understand the story inside out. Okay, what are the most important parts of the story? What are the most important ideas in the story? And of course, we have to understand what one of the themes, major themes of the story is going to be. Because an analytical essay will most likely involve a description, examination, and explanation of a story's major theme. Okay? So that is our ultimate goal and purpose for this particular short story. Now, it will require us to break it up over a period of 3 or 4 installments, at least 3 or 4 installments, and perhaps more. So right now we are on part 2. So, just to give a quick recap of the action yesterday in the story, we have a bus driver by the name of Grady Bishop, who is described in the story as being a racist and growing up in the era of segregation in the deep south United States, where segregation was the norm of society, and he grew up in a poor family. He was poorly educated, and he has a lot of problems with dealing with people in general, but specifically in dealing with black people. So he has no real solid, foundation of good quality people skills, as we say in the field today. So he's driving this bus route which services mainly black people, and he was assigned to this bus route by his route manager. But then on a particular night in November, there's a big snowstorm, and snow and road conditions are poor, and he's trying to get the people on and off the bus quickly, and he's getting more and more upset as the night goes by, and he decides to close down the route early because his bus driver supervisor told him that if it gets too dangerous, he can close the route early. So when he decides to close the route and take the bus back to the bus station, it's about 9 o'clock in the evening. He's working the 3 to 11 shift, so he's actually closing the route down 2 hours early. But just as he closes down the route after the last passenger gets off the bus, he notices a woman carrying a baby running towards the bus, and he opens the door to the bus and lets the woman on. Now, this is one of the most critical pieces of the plot right here. So I'm going to review a little bit from the text what the woman's description is, and I'll summarize just quickly what the conversation was between her and the bus driver, Grady Bishop. All right? So I'm just going to read this paragraph here, and then we'll jump ahead a little bit. So, again, he just let the last passenger off the bus. He sees this woman running towards the bus. That's when his headlights picked up the figure of a woman running in the snow, without a hat, gloves, or boots. Although she'd pulled a light shawl over the lightweight jacket and flimsy dress she was wearing, her clothing offered very little protection against the elements. As she pressed forward against the driving snow and wind, Grady saw that the woman was very young, no more than 20, and she was clutching something close to her body. What was it? Then Grady saw the baby, a small bundle wrapped in a faded pink blanket. All right, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So, the woman starts to tell her story, and this is her story. In big gulping sobs, the woman laid her story before him. I need help, please. My husband's gone to Memphis looking for work. Our baby is sick, real sick. She needs to get to the hospital. I know she'll die if I don't get help. Well, I got to go by the hospital on the way back to the garage. you can ride that far." Grady nodded for her to pay. The woman looked at the floor. "Well, pay up and get on to the back of the bus so I can get out of here." I don't have the fare," she said, quickly adding, "but if you let me ride, I promise to bring it to you in the morning." So here's the problem for Grady. The woman doesn't have bus fare. He does agree to give her a ride to the hospital at first, but when he hears that she doesn't have the bus fare, he cannot let it slide. He's got to get her off the bus now, right? And she's going to beg with him, and she's going to plead, "Don't kick me off the bus, got to take me to the hospital, I'll give you the money tomorrow." He refuses that. Then she offers her wedding ring as collateral. He refuses that. And then he says this, which really irritates me. He says, "Go on home now. You young gals get hysterical over a little fever. Nothing. It'll be fine in the morning." As he shut the door, the last sounds he heard were the mother's sobs, the baby's wail, and the moaning wind. All right? So Grady Bishop here, even though we give him a little bit, small speck of credit for allowing her on the bus in the first place and agreeing to take her to the hospital, even though he didn't have to because he had already closed the bus route down. So he does extend a little bit of generosity, a little bit of charity to her in the sense that he let her on the bus. But when he hears that she doesn't have the bus fare, that's when his mind closes. All right? He says, "You people know the rules. No money, no ride." All right? So even though she offers him a valuable possession of hers, this gold wedding ring, not good enough for him. He's not going to bend the rules or break the rules for her. And then he says, very callously, "Go on home now. You young gals get hysterical over a little fever. Nothing. It'll be fine in the morning." So, at this point, Grady Bishop not only has showed what a cold, heartless, and thoughtless racist that he is, but he also shows his stupidity. Okay? Because, again, we have to remember, he was not poorly educated. So, how does he know if it's nothing? Right? How does he know if the fever is really nothing? Where did he get his medical degree from, all of a sudden? Right? Is he a doctor? Is he a physician? No. He's a 11th child of the town drunk, and he has a poor education, probably never made it even into high school. So why does he all of a sudden assume to tell this woman, or presume to tell this woman, that the baby's fever is nothing? Okay? So he's really obnoxious here, and heartless and cruel, to kick her off the bus. And even when the woman extends the baby to him and says, "Feel her forehead," he won't even touch the baby. Right? Because the baby is black, and he doesn't want to touch a black baby. So even it says that he recoiled when she held the baby out to him. He recoiled. It's like, recoil, what does that mean? It's like if you were to put your hand on a hot stove, you would jerk your hand back because the stove is going to burn your hand. Right? That's recoiling right there. So for him, putting his hand on a baby's head, a black baby's head, is going to be like touching a hot stove. He wants nothing to do with that. So that's another indication of how deeply embedded his racism is. He won't even touch the baby to feel the baby's forehead. But he does presume to tell the woman that the fever is nothing, so she should go home and it will be okay in the morning. All right? So you tell me, how qualified is he to make a medical diagnosis on the spur of the moment without even touching the baby? So again, his stubborn obsession with the rules and the separation and the segregation between the black people and the white people is really rearing its head here in a very irritating and obnoxious way. Now, let's look at the outline here. We're going to fill in these outlines as we go. So, describe 3 things about the woman. So again, this is a very key part of the story, and all the story that follows is going to revolve around this incident of this conversation on this bus and the fact that he kicks her off the bus. So, one of the things that describes the woman is that she's very young. All right, the text tells us that she's very young. In fact, it tells us that she's no more than 20 years old. So we have a young woman here. Her husband is away from home, looking for work in Memphis, Tennessee, a couple states over from where they are. because again, we're talking about the time period probably during the Great Depression where millions of people are out of work, and therefore her husband has to go somewhere else, to another state even, looking for work. So she's left at home with this baby, and the baby is very sick, and she's very much agitated and concerned for the life of her baby. She thinks the baby's going to die if she doesn't get to the hospital. But that is not enough to sway Grady Bishop. Another thing we can conclude about the woman is that she's poor. Okay? She doesn't have a job. Her husband doesn't have a job. Her husband is out looking for a job. And the way that her clothing is described, a flimsy dress. She's not wearing boots. She's not wearing a hat. She's not wearing gloves. The baby is wrapped in a faded pink blanket. So the fact that she's black also in these time period that we're talking about here of the days of segregation, we're looking at a very huge economic gap between black people and white people in general in most of these states down in the South. So that's another thing we can consider is this economic hardship that is usually associated with the black people in these days of segregation. Now, how else do we know she's poor? Well, again, did she come out dressed for the weather? No. She probably saw the bus, grabbed the baby, put the baby in the blanket, threw on this shawl, right? It does describe that she's wearing a shawl over a lightweight jacket and a flimsy dress, but she has no boot, no hat, no gloves. She does, however, have a wedding ring, okay? And she does say that it is a gold wedding ring. So that's probably her most prized possession, is that gold wedding ring. It's probably the only valuable thing that she has. And it's certainly the only valuable thing she has to try to bargain with Grady Bishop into, talking him into giving her a ride to the hospital. So she is poor. We can safely conclude that. And another thing we can describe about the woman is that she is desperate. All right, you got this snowstorm raging. You got the temperatures dropping, maybe below, 32 degrees. So the snow is piling up. The baby is sick. The fever is on, right? She sees the bus. She grabs the baby, puts a blanket around the baby, goes out into the midst of the storm. It says the winds are howling savagely. The temperature is plummeted. And she's desperate to get to the hospital. So desperate that she's willing to bargain with the only thing that she has probably of value, which is her wedding ring. But again, that's not enough to convince Grady Bishop to have a heart. So he shows his heartlessness by kicking her off the bus. So what is the outcome? Next question. What is the outcome of Grady Bishop's refusing to take the woman to the hospital? Let's read on. Grady dismissed the incident until the next morning, when he read that it had been a record snowfall. His eyes were drawn to a small article about a colored woman and a child found frozen to death on Hall Street. No one seemed to know where the woman was going or why. No one but Grady. That gal should have done like I told her and gone on home, he said, turning to the comics. All right, so we can answer questions 2 and 3 just on that paragraph. What is the outcome of Grady Bishop's refusing to take the woman to the hospital? The woman and her baby die trying to get to the hospital. So what does the woman do after she gets kicked off the bus and Grady drives away? She tries to get the baby to the hospital by walking to the hospital. Now again, we don't know how far it is from the hospital to her house, or from her house to the hospital. We can assume it's a pretty far, trek. And in the snow, the ice, the wind, the cold temperature, etc., she maybe was out there, got tired, too much strain, too much stress, physical, fatigue. She maybe sat down to take a rest, and then the cold temperature started to seep in, and she started to get more and more lethargic and couldn't get up. And then she sat down and stayed, in a sitting position, and then eventually she and her baby froze to death on the side of the road. So we can assume it's sort of out in the middle of nowhere where she was, because no cars, no trucks, no taxis, no buses except Grady's, and he's already taken off. So we can assume that's what happened. is that in her desperation, and again, this would also indicate how desperate she was, that she tried to walk, how many miles it was, we don't know, but she tried to walk in the middle of a raging snowstorm where the temperature was, way below wind chill factor, way below freezing, and she froze. All right? And she and the baby die. Now, that's tragic right there. But what is Grady Bishop's response to that? How does Grady Bishop feel when he reads the news story about the woman's death? It says that nobody knows what she was doing out there or why she was out there, but he knows. But what's the thing? What's the point? He doesn't care. He shows no remorse. Okay? His reaction, his feelings about the news story that he reads, proves to us that he's a heartless and mean-spirited and cruel and unfeeling, uncaring individual. Okay? Because, what does he say? He says, that gal should have done like I told her and gone on home, he said, turning to the comics. So what is he doing? Is he taking any responsibility for his role in the woman's death? In his, heartless, uncharitable kicking her off the bus and leaving her out there in the cold weather and in the raging snowstorm? Does he take even 1 ounce of responsibility for that? No. Does it even register for a fraction of a second that this is somehow his fault? No. He doesn't even think about the fact that he is the one to blame for this tragedy. He doesn't even care that it was the woman's death because he doesn't blame himself. He blames the woman. All right? If the woman had done like I told her, that wouldn't have happened, so it's not my fault. All right? That is what he's saying. He's saying, another way to put it is, she didn't listen to me, so therefore it's on her. Whatever happened to her and her baby is not on me, it's on her because she didn't listen to me. I told her to go home, she didn't go home. So that's not my problem. Right? What kind of cold, mean, I don't want to use, a improper word, but what kind of mean SOB would think that? Okay? He doesn't care. He shows no remorse. And in fact, he reads the story and in 10 seconds, he draws his conclusion. It's not my fault, it's her fault. And then what does he do? He turns over to Garfield and reads the comics. Or whatever other comics there were in those days. So it doesn't even register for a fraction of a second that he has any role or any responsibility in the woman's death, nor does he care. Because it's not his fault, it's her fault. Now, what happens to Grady Bishop 1 year later? All right? So, one of the main points of the story is that you can't treat people like that. I don't care if it's a black person, white person, Asian person, colored person, you name it, you can't treat people like that. So, there's going to be consequences for this type of action. All right? This kind of unfeeling, uncaring, and insensitive and obnoxious, stepping on other people, there's going to be consequences. So, what are the consequences going to be? Let's read on. It says, it was exactly 1 year later, on the anniversary of the record snowfall, that Grady was assigned the Hall Street Express again. Just as before, a storm heaped several inches of snow onto the city in a matter of hours, making driving extremely hazardous. By nightfall, Grady decided to close the route. But just as he was making the turnaround at the East Side Loop, his headlights picked up a woman running in the snow. The same woman he'd seen the previous year. Death had not altered her desperation. Still holding onto the blanketed baby, the small-framed woman pathetically struggled to reach the bus. Grady closed his eyes but couldn't keep them shut. She was still coming, but from where? The answer was too horrible to consider, so he chose to let his mind find a more reasonable explanation. From some dark corner of his childhood, he heard his father's voice, slurred by alcohol, mocking him. "It ain't the same woman, dummy. You know how they all look alike." Grady remembered his father with bitterness and swore at the thought of him. This was the same woman. Grady argued with his father's memory, taking no comfort in being right. Grady watched the woman's movements breathlessly as she stepped out of the headlight beam and approached the door. She stood outside the door, waiting. Waiting. The gray coldness of fear slipped into the driver's seat. Grady sucked air into his lungs in big gulps, feeling out of control. Fear moved his foot to the gas pedal, careening the bus out into oncoming traffic. Headlights, a truck. Fear made Grady hit the brakes. The back of the bus went into a sliding spin, slamming into a tree. Grady's stomach was crushed against the steering wheel, rupturing his liver and spleen. "You've really done it now, lunkhead." As he drifted into the final darkness, he heard a woman's sobs, a baby wailing, or was it just the wind? So what happened? So, what happens to him? He sees the woman's ghost, he gets scared, crashes the bus, and dies. All right? This is his consequence for his heartlessness. The woman's ghost shows up at the exact same location, exactly 1 year later when the snowstorm is on, and he sees the woman carrying this baby approaching the bus. And he knows that it's the same woman, but at the same time, he cannot believe it's the same woman because the woman's been dead for a year. If the woman's been dead for a year, how can it be the same woman standing outside in the snow waiting for him to open the door of the bus? Again, think about his childhood. This is where his relationship with his father comes in. All right? How did Grady Bishop end up as such an inveterate racist? It's because his father was an inveterate racist. And we know his father was an inveterate racist because of the line that his father tells him that he remembers from his childhood. "It ain't the same woman, dummy. You know how they all look alike." Okay? So just from that one expression, we can gather some conclusions about what kind of childhood and what kind of upbringing Grady Bishop had. Number one, his own father is calling him dummy. So his own father is verbally abusive to him. And number two, he's telling Grady Bishop that all black people look alike. All right? That's racist no matter what way you slice it. It's like saying all Asian people look alike, or all Spanish people look alike, or all Mexican people look alike, or all black people look alike. You name it, it's racism no matter what way you slice it. So his father is racist, for sure. And his father, as we know, was the town drunk and an alcoholic, of course. So there's a key word in here. His father's voice slurred by alcohol. So slurring your speech is a reference to being drunk. And when you're drunk, you can't really speak properly. Your words don't come out right. So you make mistakes in your pronunciation and the way you talk. So his father's voice slurred by alcohol, mocking him. And Grady remembers this as soon as he sees the ghost of this woman. How his father's words come back to haunt him, so to speak. And then as soon as he remembers his father's memory, or he remembers his father, what word is used to associate his memory with his father is the word bitterness. So bitterness, again, emphasizes this bad relationship that they had. And in fact, Grady swears even at the memory of his father. All right, we have no idea of knowing how long his father has been dead, but even the point that Grady is now an adult, he thinks back to his childhood and his father as a child. When he was a child growing up, in his father's house, even the very memory of his father causes him to swear. All right? Like to put a bad feeling instantly on his father's memory. So now he's thinking, okay, it can't be the same woman, but it is the same woman. So now he's, in a state of conflict with the supernatural. Because if you're experiencing a ghostly encounter like he is, what is your natural instinct going to be? All right? You might think you might start shouting and screaming and running away. But no, the most likely reaction is going to be fear, no question. But frozen fear. Okay? So he's frozen with fear here, watching this woman come out in front of the headlights of his bus and then walk away around the corner of the bus and stand right outside the door of the bus. And he's looking down at this woman standing right there, and he's convinced it's the same woman, but it can't be because she's been dead for a year. So how can it be the same woman? Now, that's where fear takes over. All right? So at first he's frozen, but then once that woman is standing outside the door, he has a choice to make. Either open the door or get out of there as quickly as possible. And the fear that he has inside of him takes over. And he steps on the gas. All right? So it says, fear moved his foot to the gas pedal. So he's overcome with fear. He's overwhelmed with fear. His instinct is either to fight or to flight. So in this case, he chooses to flee. And he steps on the gas, and what happens? The road conditions are bad. The bus swerves out of control, hits a tree. Okay? And now, go back to the original description of Grady Bishop. It describes him as being obese. Okay? What is obese? Extremely overweight. So, you can imagine that between the steering wheel of the bus and his stomach is a very little space. Okay? He's probably squeezed into the driver's seat. So his stomach is actually pressed up against the steering wheel. So when this bus hits the tree, the force of that impact sends the steering wheel right into his midsection and causes a tremendous internal injury. It says rupturing his liver and his spleen. Okay, so internal organs damaged because the steering wheel, the force of that impact, the steering wheel is sent right into his abdomen and crushes him. And the liver is ruptured, the spleen is ruptured, so he's bleeding internally and lethally. So, what does he remember before he passes away? The last thing he remembers is not his father's words. Not his own words, but his father's words. When it says, "You've really done it now, lunkhead," who's speaking that? Grady Bishop is not, calling himself lunkhead, which is another word for dummy. All right? These are words that he remembers his father saying to him, calling him lunkhead. All right? Lunkhead, chowderhead, idiot, dummy, moron, all the same type of adjective. So the last thing he remembers is his father's words, again, mocking him. "You idiot! What did you do?" As he drifted off into the final darkness. So the last thing he remembers is his father's word. The last thing he hears before passing into eternity is the woman's crying and the baby crying. And then lights out. Tomorrow, or in the next installment, we will continue reading the story and jump ahead to the second part of the story. We're going to flash forward 25 years and see the entrance of another character into the story. So Grady Bishop is now completely out of the picture. Thank you for watching. We'll continue again very soon with the next installment.